Hello and welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue, the second in a series of dialogues on U.S. tech regulation and geostrategic competition. The first event focused on issues pertaining to national security. And today's discussion with policy and technology experts will focus on strengthening economic competitiveness through smart tech regulation. My name is Maggie Lake, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator this morning. Technology is increasingly at the center of geostrategic and economic competition, and the race is on to lead in the development and deployment of next-generation technologies. From semiconductors to 5G, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing, advanced technologies will be a major contributor to future economic growth and competitiveness in the U.S. and countries around the world. While the U.S. has led the world in a range of advanced technologies, China and other countries are rapidly catching up, with governments around the world advancing data governance and other policies to bolster domestic industries. Against this backdrop, the U.S. Congress is currently considering a range of legislative proposals aimed at fostering competition across the sector. Today's event, which includes policy and technology experts, will explore evolving geostrategic competition in the sector, the role of policy in fostering competition, and potential impacts that proposed legislation could have on economic competitiveness going forward. The discussion is underpinned by research by Foreign Policy's in-house research division, FP Analytics, which can be found on the event page. Before diving in, I'd like to extend a big thanks to the Computer and Communications Industry Association, CCIA, for helping us make this event possible. We are pleased to see so many of you tuned in and watching our live streams on social media. We have reserved a portion of this event for questions from our global audience, so make sure we hear from you. Here's how you can participate. If you're on Zoom, click the Q&A button below and submit your questions. Be sure to include your name, organization, and where you're writing from. If you're joining us on the phone or watching a live stream, you can email us your questions. The address is events@foreignpolicy.com. And of course, we encourage you to chime in on social media. Be sure to use the hashtag US Tech Regulation. All right, let's get started. To help frame the conversation, I'm excited to welcome our first guest, whose work is at the heart of these complex and pressing issues. John Bateman, Senior Fellow in the Technology and International Affairs Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. John's work focuses on large-scale policy challenges such as U.S.-China tech tensions, global influence operations, and systemic cyber risk. Prior to his role at Carnegie, John was Special Assistant to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford Jr., and served as Director for Cyber Strategy Implementation in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He is also the author of U.S.-China Technology Decoupling, a strategy and policy framework. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, great to be with you, Maggie, and thanks to FP for putting on this event.
So I think it's a really important time, I think, to get sort of the insights from someone who's watched this space so closely over the last decade. How have you seen technology shape the international competitive landscape?
Yeah, so I think one way to track that is this increasing awareness in the halls of power in Washington, D.C., that technology is no longer, can be seen as a neutral commercial marketplace, but rather is an arena of interstate competition. And this idea is commonly known as techno-nationalism. And over the last 10 years, techno-nationalism has been ascendant around the world, actually. Many countries, from China to India, have come to want to have a greater national strategic control and alignment over technology within their borders. And some of those countries see that as a key economic concern. And in some ways, that was a reaction to US dominance of the internet and of many leading digital technologies. Now, I think what's changed in the last 10 years in the United States, and to some extent in Europe and elsewhere, is an awareness that China is actually rising to become a key competitive threat in some of the major technology areas that are predicted to be economically strategic in the future and to have national security implications. So you mentioned several of them early on. But China, for example, is already a global leader in 5G telecommunications equipment, is among the leaders in smartphones, machine learning, Internet of Things, electric vehicles and batteries, drones. And so there's a tremendous anxiety in the Western aligned world as to maintaining technological leadership across a range of different disciplines.
Yeah. So as we've seen this rise in countries, techno nationalism, and really it's sort of, supporting the home team, right? If we put it in really plain language, a real effort. And with countries, especially we talk about China, who really play the long game, which I think is, something that's sort of underappreciated, and throw enormous amounts of resources at doing that. So against that trend and that development, how do you see the US fitting in?
Yeah, so the US is trying to accomplish several things at once. It's trying to manage the technology relationship with China, which is increasingly seen as the key systemic rival and strategic competitor. And there's a lot of open questions as to what exactly the objective is with China and how that will align in a coherent set of policies and a national strategy that could be enduring and sensible. At the same time, the United States needs to manage its relationship with its own allies and partners, which to some extent are sometimes taken for granted and simply described amorphously as like-minded countries or techno-democracies, which is a rather new term, but it's often just assumed that countries that are friendly to the United States will be ready to join up to some kind of techno-democratic coalition, which increasingly is thought of as the future of trade relations. And then finally, there's the rest of the world, whether this is conceived of as the global South or the less developed world, generally countries that are not generating their own advanced technologies, but provide a global market for things like 5G or software ICT services. And here this is kind of often thought of as, you might call it a technological great game, an opening of an open competition between the US aligned world and the Chinese aligned world for economic and strategic market share and ultimately leverage in many, many other countries.
Spheres of influence, right? That's what we've been hearing a lot of in this, layered on this outside of the space. You look, I think there's a recognition. We hear a lot about deglobalization, regionalization,
Right.
spheres of influence, and, the sort of and that crosses over politics, crosses over the economy, crosses over national security, and is incredibly complex when you're trying to think about that, all of those moving parts at once. What are some of the underappreciated issues or risks in terms of US competitiveness when we think about that complex background?
Yeah, I think you're right, Maggie, that there's increasing talk of deglobalization, regionalization, other new modes of conceiving of international technology trade. But on the other hand, a lot of it is still very poorly conceptualized and kind of schizophrenic at times. So, for example, in the United States, you still hear criticisms of Chinese unfair trade practices often held up against the WTO benchmark. Or held up against, what is described as the open international trading system. On the other hand, you hear many people in the United States intellectually moving away from the WTO mentality and conceiving of US economic goals in terms of a kind of blending of what's called economic security with national security. And so there's this sense that a larger number of industries could be considered critical to US well-being and somehow protected under some umbrella that has yet to be defined. I think one underappreciated factor is that the US policy has been heavily focused on what might be called defense or thwarting Chinese advancement or competitiveness. There's been an extraordinary array of policy innovations intensifying the restrictions that are placed on the Chinese tech sector, whether that's export controls, tariffs, trade barriers, visa restrictions, law enforcement pressure. I could go on and on. There's been relatively little focus on running faster, self-improvement, or what sometimes is called offense. Congress is starting on this with the CHIPS Act and the broader China bills, and you might even conceive of antitrust reform as a form of running faster or self-improvement. But it's so emergent, has so many political and institutional barriers, it's often much easier just to have a boogeyman. The other thing that's underappreciated, I would say, is the reality that we are deeply interdependent in a global technological ecosystem that involves China. And that the kind of idealized image of decoupling that some in Washington have of a kind of cost-free, pain-free, risk-free process where the United States has all the leverage and we can pull up the drawbridge and not pay any economic costs, I think is fanciful. So policymakers, to some degree, as they've become more acute about the threats of technological interdependence, have started to lose sight of the reality of continued economic and technological interdependence and the risks of a precipitous or overzealous technological decoupling.
That is such an enormously important point that you just made there. And I just really want to sort of take a moment, because this idealized decoupling, I mentioned before playing the long game. This is also the sort of the realistic nuance of having a really thoughtful conversation around this in a political environment where it's just easier to kind of go for the click headline, if you will, in real time, because this is, it's extremely complicated. I mean, we just saw what happened to supply chains. We got a very real-time idea of how integrated this global economy is. So if we think about the range of bills that are before Congress, that are looking to foster domestic and international competition, do you see a coherent strategy across these efforts? Do you see an understanding of this, the sort of complications of decoupling or of addressing competition, or are some of these measures working at cross purposes?
No, it's not that coherent, and that's not altogether surprising. First of all, we're only about 10 years into this intellectual shift toward a China-oriented techno-nationalism, and only about 5 years into the policy development to flesh out that intellectual shift. So folks in Washington, D.C. Really have not cohered around the basic purposes, including such fundamental matters as, are we trying to advance US interests in relative terms, in which case we might be willing to accept some kind of lose-lose dynamics where we hurt China and hurt ourselves in the process, but they're hurt more? Or are we trying to advance in absolute terms, suggesting that we might be comfortable with some amount of win-win in areas that we see as plausible? That really has not yet been decided, and that there's voices in each camp in both parties, on Capitol Hill and in the administration. So that's one thought about the lack of coherence. The other thought is that institutionally and politically, the American government is just classically plagued with coherence problems. I mean, people like me who work at think tanks have spent decades wrapping Washington's knuckles over not being coherent or strategic on whatever the issue is. And so, to some extent, we need to grade on a curve. I think we're not there yet. So for example, the China bills before Congress, they have the right move in terms of investing again in the United States, in spending billions on research and development, which has been a huge deficit over the recent decades. Focusing on semiconductor fabrication at home, which is a huge strategic vulnerability. So they're moving in the right direction. At the same time, there is a continued push toward intensifying restrictive measures as well, most notably in the realm of outbound investment screening. And we probably do need something like that, but I think the ideas floating around are often kind of formless, amorphous, potentially much more sweeping than is really necessary.
Yeah. Do we have a problem of these conversations being siloed? Because it's hard to talk about. And I think this is going to come up as we have the conversation throughout this virtual dialogue. You have the conversation of economic competitiveness, very hard to carve that out from national security. I mean, they're all sort of interwoven. Do we have a problem in terms of forming a cohesive strategy, that they're happening in isolation and siloed? Do we need to sort of bring them together somehow? What are some of the policy tools that could be leveraged so that we are doing this the right way, strengthening competitiveness in the global market and not sort of defeating ourselves with kind of countermeasures, if you will?
Yeah, you've hit on several key problems here. One is siloing. So there are so many different silos. There's an industry-specific silo. So for example, semiconductors, it's a very technical field. It's hard for outsiders to understand the semiconductor supply chain and kind of leading edge semiconductor technology and how it all works. Certainly a lot of political leadership in Washington has only a dim understanding of this critical ecosystem. It's much more complex than just pumping oil. So that's one silo. Another set of silos has to do with the fracturing of regulatory and political authority in the United States. So you've got, let's say, the Commerce Department, which is overseeing export controls and this new ICTS supply chain regulation. Then on the other hand, you've got the State Department, which has its own export control list, which is distinct from the Commerce list. You've got the Treasury Department, which is overseeing financial sanctions and some of the outbound investment screening, and those sanctions are sometimes even thought of as export controls and have that effect as well. And CFIUS then is thrown in there. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States brings all of these organizations together, but is very opaque, does not let the public in on the rationales behind its decisions. So there are any number of silos here, including the one that you mentioned, that many of the loudest voices driving China tech or tech policy in general in the United States are from the national security community, less so from the economic community. I think business interests and economists have huge stake in what's going on, but politically, they're less influential at times, and I think a lot of business leaders are just trying to keep their heads down. Meaning that the loudest voices in the room are those in the military intelligence community and their allies on Capitol Hill, who are critical voices on national security threats, but may not be best positioned to integrate the whole complexity of technological innovation.
Yeah, excellent point. We have a question because, of course, this isn't because I think of that national security ban. It certainly comes up. There is a focus on China, but it's not related to China, as you pointed out.
Right.
This is a global issue. We have a question from Richard. You referred to antitrust activity as possible offensive weapon. Please elaborate. In particular, is the EU approach to antitrust an example of an offensive weapon when applied against foreign companies? I think let's tag on to that. The US-EU Trade and Technology Council, how is that impacting economic competitiveness? Talk to us a little bit about what you see happening, in the EU.
Yeah. So on the antitrust piece, the language here can be a little confusing. When I talk about defense and offense, what I mean by that is that defense is thwarting the other guy, hobbling China. Whereas offense is actually trying to move the ball down the field yourself, right? So that is the sense in which antitrust reforms, if they could succeed in renewing competitive dynamism within the EU or the United States, could be an effective offensive weapon, meaning we need to have the most innovative companies possible and the most successful markets possible. So I'm generally in favor of antitrust reforms. I haven't looked specifically at the Digital Markets Act. I'm more familiar with some of the other EU regulation. I think maybe the stereotype in Washington is that the EU overregulates and is seeking to hobble US companies, and there's some truth to that. Of course, there's also great truth in the European stereotype that the United States is kind of sitting on its hands and not doing anything about evident problems in the competitiveness of US technology markets and other social, political, and economic externalities of the big tech ecosystem. So the truth needs to be somewhere in between here. And that's where we get to the question about the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. Some degree of dialogue is very healthy. We need, as a group of supposedly or aspirationally like-minded countries, to be on the same page in terms of our regulatory toolkits. They're never going to be the same. They shouldn't be the same. But it actually benefits the US markets to get some pressure from the EU antitrust and other regulators. And then I think it also benefits the Europeans to hear the other voice from the American government, which of course is overseeing much of the innovation ecosystem that we collectively share.
John, it was a perfect way to set up this conversation. We just scratched the surface, but yes. I encourage everyone to read your report. Having not only a really thoughtful, intelligent conversation around this, where all parties are involved from all the different interests, not, breaking down some of those silos and finding a lot in this middle ground. I mean, we've sort of lost that. I think it's incredibly important in this conversation. So I encourage everyone to read. John has a fantastic piece out on U.S.-China decoupling and a strategically important implementation. How do we do it? How do we get to the right answers? And then how do we importantly implement that in this really, really complex area is fantastic. I learned a lot from it. So John, appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thanks so much. Time to bring in and continue the conversation with our panel and talk about the implications of some of the bills before Congress. I am pleased to introduce, first of all, Sean Heather. He is the Senior Vice President, International Regulatory Affairs and Antitrust at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Sean leads the Chamber's Center for Global Regulatory Cooperation, which is seeking to align trade, regulatory, and competition policy. He is a non-government advisor to the International Competition Network and is working on data governance issues, including privacy, cybersecurity, and AI. Dr. Katie Suominen, founder and CEO of Next Trade Group, where she supports governments, multilateral development banks, and Fortune 500 companies enable trade through technology. She's built multiple global initiatives and public-private partnerships to enable digital trade and has written a number of books on trade, globalization, and technology, most recently, Revolutionizing World Trade, How Disruptive Technologies Open Opportunities for All. And Clete Willems, non-resident senior fellow, Economic Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. He's also a partner at Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, and former deputy assistant to the president for international economics and deputy director for the Economic Council. Prior to that, Clete was a trade negotiator and WTO litigator at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. We've got a lot of experience on this panel. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you for having us.
Good to be with you, Maggie.
Fantastic. Sean, I would like to start with you and really just picking up on John's comments. As I said, I think he set the stage for this, in particular, just how really complex these topics are and how sort of interconnected. When we look at the global competitive landscape and how it's changed, how it relates to tech, what are some of the unappreciated risks you're seeing, and any pickup from what you heard John say?
Well, what I heard John say, I think, is an excellent way to start out our conversation, which is there's a lot going on, and it's very difficult to follow all the bouncing balls and figure out how they stitch together. And when we think about what it means for our members and how they see the world, I think they see it as being an increasingly difficult place to find the ability to compete in foreign markets. We talked a lot, I think, from John's comments about what China's been doing, less so on Europe, but Europe has been kind of in this techno-national view where they are interested in tech sovereignty. They have made it clear they don't want to be dependent on either China or the United States. They want to find their own tech giants. And so they've embarked on a series of policies that, quite frankly, are concerning to us in the United States, because there has been such a long and storied partnership where, quite frankly, many of the leading US tech companies have deep investments in Europe, have deep employee bases there, and do lots of R&D in Europe. And so while we may be having a debate about decoupling from China, Europe seems to be having somewhat of a debate about decoupling from the United States. And this is something that I think has a lot of U.S. businesses thinking about, at least in the tech space. What does this mean vis-a-vis two major markets that, prior to this current state of affairs, people had, I think, predictable game plans for how to approach those. And as a result, the United States and our technology companies have become the envy of the world. Now they are often under attack and increasingly being questioned, and barriers are being put in their place to be successful.
Katie, it really struck me. I know you particularly look at these disruptive technologies, through the lens of trade. And I was struck by John's comments about this idea of this techno-democratic alliance being a future cornerstone for trade. And yet there's sort of a lot of assumptions and vagueness around this without really drilling down into the details, even including, what are critical industries for economic competitiveness? I mean, when you talk about technology, it is an enormously broad term. What areas do you see as important for future economic development? And how do you think the U.S. can strengthen its position when it comes to some of these developing some of these critical technologies?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for having me. Technology is now permeating all industries, from manufacturing to agriculture to services that, of course, we are championing. And I think what we need as the United States, and something that the House Competes Act and the bill that is in the Senate and now is being reconciled, make the point about both having the right talent across industries for us to tap that technology, develop that technology, and apply it in different industries. And then through, say, offering visas to entrepreneurs, bringing in doctorates with work visas as well. And then, of course, what was emphasized before, investing in R&D. So, we need to keep investing. We've been one of the top markets in the world to invest in R&D. I think we're at about 3% of GDP now, behind Germany, Korea, but still ahead of China. And this federal spending on R&D to promote innovation and application of technologies and disruptive technologies across industries is very important, as is continuing to promote the R&D spend from the big technology companies that frankly have been keys to promoting innovation as well, and R&D spend as well. And then something that was discussed before, and where I think we share an interest with Europe, although there are, of course, challenges in the bilateral relationships, is this open markets for digital trade, digital technologies. And there, I absolutely agree with Sean that we have a number of challenges as countries are setting up their digital regulations, are passing laws on, say, on data privacy, data transfers, are also, applying new cybersecurity standards, and taxing mostly US companies, also their own digital companies. And there is kind of creeping protectionism, discrimination against, US businesses, as well as foreign companies in general in areas like cloud computing and others. So I think we've been very good at championing this open global trading system through trade agreements like USMCA. Now we have this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement as well, moving. And this is something that I think we share an interest in with Europe, is to promote also this open trading system for our competitiveness, so that we are able to then move data, export and import our services, our digital developer services, where we truly have a comparative advantage.
Yeah. And this is where gridlock is not good. I mean, when we fall behind on the regulatory aspect of this, while others are moving ahead, this is where you have dissonance, right? This is where we are not all on the same page and are not finding common ground. Clete, how would you assess the US competitive position when it comes to these critical technologies? And, again, where do you see the risks and maybe the opportunities?
Sure, and I will try to be precise, Maggie, but there are so many comments that I already want to elaborate on. It's been a great conversation. What I want to focus on here is, I think, the juxtaposition between what's going on in the United States and what's going on in the EU and China in particular. And I think we're starting to have this conversation. John alluded to the TTC. And one of the things he said is that he hoped that the US and the EU could cooperate better on the regulation of technology companies. I agree. But one of the big problems with the TTC is that the Europeans have refused to have that conversation. They've refused to engage with us on the Data Act, on the Digital Marketing Act, on the Digital Services Act. And that has been a big problem. And I think that if you look at the world, and you look at, again, I'm going to use those three places, US, EU, and China, and you look at the reasons we are regulating, they are very different. And it's very concerning to me. So you look at China, And a lot of people talk about the crackdown on big tech in China, which is ongoing. So first of all, they've pulled back a little bit because they're worried about their economy. But secondly, it's less about antitrust in the way that we think of it in the United States. And it's more about Xi Jinping wanting to eliminate diffuse centers of power that can challenge his authority. It's about getting more control over those companies for the state. He didn't like Jack Ma speaking out, so he went after him. I mean, so that's China's rationale. And they have a whole other set of policies that discriminate in favor of their companies and against ours. So I wonder whether this is really going to hurt their competitive position. Then you look at Europe, and Europe has basically singled out US companies and said, we are going to target them for discriminatory treatment. We're not going to treat our companies the same way. And a lot of Europeans would be very explicit and say it's more or less because they want their tech sector to catch ours. So they're targeting us as well. Then you look at the US and you look at the antitrust legislation that's being considered right now in Congress, and it's basically doing the same thing as Europe. It's singling out US companies for a whole range of regulation, bans on different kinds of behaviors, and it pretty much gerrymanders out of the scope our European and Chinese competitors. And so you look at those three things happening, and all three of them, I think, are bad for the United States. And so we need to get our arms around this in a meaningful way, in the way that we engage internationally, and push back on these policies for the right reason, and then don't hobble ourselves at the same time.
Yeah. Sean, I'm sure you have an opinion about that. Are you, how concerned are you about the level of state sponsorship from competitors? And, what is the feeling about what's happening in terms of using antitrust to try to address some of these concerns? And I in particular, I mean, I'm sure your members are unhappy about it, but what's the way forward? You heard John say there's a middle ground. There are some issues. By doing nothing, we were left open to what's developed now. Again, that sort of lagging behind, has kind of created this situation. How are you seeing this, and what is the way forward?
I think taking a step back, if you think about how to optimize competition in the market, you can either do things to promote it or you can do things to manage it. And antitrust is there in theory to be there to promote it. What we're talking about in the United States with these bills that I think Clete talked about quite effectively is managed competition. And you can never find a way in which the government will manage competition and result in greater competitiveness. That is not a formula for keeping the U.S. Strong economically. And what do I mean by that? You have in this particular antitrust bill and several others like it, this idea that we're going to capture a series of companies based off of their market capitalization. Market capitalization has nothing to do with how competitive the market is. It has to do with whether investors see growth opportunities within those companies. And market capitalization is a metric of growth opportunities, not just in the United States, but around the world. So the very fact that the trigger in many of these laws is to go after our biggest and best and brightest opportunities for growth by basically saying, if your market cap is above a certain dollar number, you're going to be given special treatment, and not special treatment to be promoted and protected, but we're going to put serious ankle weights around you to make you have to, find a way not to be able to swim so effectively. That is not a policy path for keeping the United States competitive. It is the exact opposite. When you think about what this means, if the U.S. was to do this, it would greenlight the rest of the world to advance policies like this against American leading technology companies. Not only has Europe headed down this path, but we see countries like Turkey and Korea and Australia and probably a dozen others that I could go through here and name that are beginning to think about similar kinds of managed competition outcomes that are targeting U.S. companies at the expense of or an effort to promote their domestic competitors. Look, when you ask the question, what does smart tech regulation look like, which is, I think, part of the title of the panel, the Chamber recognizes that there are questions that are raised from the digital transformation of the economy and whether we need to find new ways to address those. But I can tell you the answer is not to do it through antitrust. When you look at the companies that are captured, many of them are what I would refer to as a modern day conglomerate. Take Amazon, for example. People know of Amazon as Amazon.com, but they also are Amazon Web Services. They're also Whole Foods. They also own a movie studio. The same can be said for Google and Apple and Microsoft and Facebook. These all have different business lines, and to suggest that we're going to put all of those business lines underneath one rubric. When you go up to Congress and Capitol Hill, some people want to address content moderation. Some people want to address digital advertising. Some people want to say we want to have small business have access to e-commerce platforms. Some people have, this, that, and the other complaint. If you want to address those issues, they should be addressed with targeted legislation that speaks to each of those issues. One should not try to take a sweeping judgment that says all of these companies need to operate all of their business lines in a particular manner or fashion. That is not good regulation. That does not acutely address the problems that may arise from the digital economy in a way that politically is smart and savvy and also effective. So when we look at these antitrust issues and this question that you raised about, well, maybe the U.S. has been asleep at the switch, we can have a debate as to whether existing antitrust law should be enforced. It's another debate to have whether we need to change the law. And we have increasingly now more antitrust cops on the beat. The attorney generals in the states have brought a series of cases. The FTC and DOJ, starting under the Trump administration, became much more aggressive. That has continued under this administration. So there is a distinct difference between antitrust enforcement, which some may argue has been lax in recent years, versus let's rechange the antitrust laws to ensure certain outcomes in the market. And when that happens, you're not talking about promoting competition, you're talking about managing it.
Maggie, can I jump in? Is that all right?
Sure.
Sean made some great points, and there's two that I just want to elaborate on. The first is talking about the way that the bill is structured to focus solely on size. And I think that is a major flaw in the legislation. And I would recommend folks to look at what the American Bar Association had to say about it. And basically their critique, which I think is correct, is that this bill is going after common business practices of a lot of these large technology companies, but it's not tying that business practice to any sort of unfair competition in the marketplace. It's not tying it to abuse of market power. It's simply banning it because they're big. And that to me illustrates what one of the fundamental problems is with this agenda. If you look at the conservatives and the Republican Party, and they talk about their concerns about big tech, it's around censorship. So if you want to deal with censorship of conservative voices, deal with censorship of conservative voices through a targeted strategy. Don't just penalize these companies in a punitive way. And on the left, again, if the goal is abuse of market power, actually write a bill that deals with that. Don't just go after them because they're big, and create a dynamic in the US where we penalize success. And happy to elaborate on that further. I have some ideas on how we can do that, especially to deal with some of the concerns on the right. But I just thought those were important points to interject. So thank you for
No, thank you for that, Clee. And Katie, this is exactly as I'm listening to this going through my mind, and I will push back a little and play devil's advocate because, I feel like the idea of self-policing, any large companies, and I'm not just talking about technology. I mean, we have a long history of the fact that doesn't really work very well in the US, or there are at least grounds where you can understand why there is great concern. And I think based on what we see transpire over the last few years, I can understand why there is public concern about this. But Sean said something, and this really struck out at me about content moderation. It feels like a lot of it is, and going back to John's point, very broad and large concerns about concentration of power and content and impact on society. But have we really understood what the problem is properly? And are we using the right tools to go after it? It seems like maybe this is not lining up in the way that we're going to get the result that's really at the root of the concern.
Yeah, I fully agree that our traditional antitrust legislation, how we have enforced it, very much focuses on protecting consumer welfare, not kind of protecting competition, but not the different competitors, if you want. In the EU, it's more about looking at the number of firms in the market, thinking that if there's only so many firms, a handful of companies, that's somehow bad, as Sean alluded, or that if you have a very big company with large market cap, that's somehow negative. In the United States, we've never had that practice. We look at the impact on the consumer, and fully agree with Sean and Clete that we're I believe we're copying Europe excessively here. Ironically, Europe has precisely issued these digital market acts and other bills of similar kind in order to tame kind of US companies and US competitors. And we've been also seeking to kind of gently push back against Europe in the Transatlantic Technology Council and Europe's DMA. But I think as we're doing this now and copying this practice at home, we're kind of opening the door to what Sean was talking about, enabling other countries then to have similar legislation that hobbles and hampers our businesses out there. And so far, I think there's no particular problem or nothing to fix per se in our antitrust. Antitrust works. It's a matter of enforcing it better, but and then addressing these other issues like content through other tools. Now, I have to say, like we have been, championing, say, the Section 230, for instance, for enabling platforms to have some liability limitations from the content that the users generate, and that has served us very well. That has served our internet ecosystem very well, and I think curbing that would be very detrimental for our economy, for our technology companies, our technology leadership, and again, send kind of a bad signal to other countries. So while there are very legitimate issues about content moderation and so forth, we also have had these discussions several years ago, 20 years ago already, to think about how we address content and to curb those. I think we also need to be very careful about potential unintended consequences on things like free speech and US technology leadership, and also the incentive that investors might have then to invest in future technology companies if they are hampered by this number of regulations, whether it's on content or whether it's on antitrust.
Yeah.
Let me just quickly add two things. One is, when we get back to the question about our national security, and we're talking about things like quantum computing and AI and next generational technologies, you need scale. You need scale. So this idea that you can reflexively say big is bad is one that will not allow you to scale. And it's not just in those technologies. You need scale for all kinds of things. And quite frankly, scale is what got us through the pandemic. It was the larger operations, not just of tech, but of non-tech players, that allowed us to manage our way through. I mean, the scale of big partnering with small in pharma allowed us to come up with innovations and get those innovations for vaccines deployable in kind of record time. So scale is important for us to be competitive, not only here at home, but abroad. And we can't just attack it. And I think the other concern here is it's not about just today's companies. Companies' market caps rise and fall. And you look at who was the top market cap companies a decade ago, they weren't the companies that are there today, and they probably won't be the companies that are there tomorrow in the next decade. And the way this legislation is written, essentially future companies, once they grow above and beyond a certain market cap, they become captured by this legislation. So this really limits the competitiveness and growth opportunities for companies, which will ultimately pervert the way in which they think about how they do business. What do you do if your market cap is right at $550 billion and you want to stay below that $600 billion threshold? You decide to stop competing. You decide to start entering into new markets. You decide maybe not to bring that next innovation that might grow your market cap as a result. So there are all kinds of unintended consequences by taking this approach as a backdoor way to regulate what are a myriad of complaints that people may have, or gripes that people may have with big tech, putting it all into an antitrust basket, when antitrust is really a limited tool, is the formula for absolutely undermining our competitiveness.
So Sean, let me put you a question to you, and I think this addresses the concern. And for scale, I'll also put in capital, right? I mean, you need enormous investment. And I think Katie was mentioning it, and John mentioned it about, the mix between public and private capital. It can't all be public capital. a lot of it's going to have to be private capital. And so when you have large companies, they're going to have the capital base to be able to invest in those new technologies and keep pushing the envelope. I think the issue comes in on partnership, right? And so Derek writes, if companies like Amazon are able to take a loss in one of their business lines until their competition is priced out of the market, but remain viable due to their parent company having other business lines, what role does the government have in ensuring market competition for entrepreneurs and small businesses? So that's sort of that's the concern that policymakers may be hearing and, getting from their constituents when it comes to the size of some of these companies. How, I think this is a question of, is the answer punitive or is it incentive? How can we create an environment for those smaller companies, the entrepreneurs who maybe don't have access to VC capital, so that they're able to build up a track record and thrive without dismantling the large companies who are critical, as you say, to not only economics, but national security?
Well, Maggie, I think his question was more about what is called predatory pricing. And what you've asked a question about is kind of more venture capital and how to fund the next generation of startups. And both of those are under antitrust scrutiny. There are other bills in Congress that are suggesting that once you reach a certain size, you can no longer buy small startup companies. The idea that, big has gobbled up everything that's small. A lot of venture capital money goes into small companies with the idea that those companies ultimately grow to a point where they get bought. And so, the venture capital community is very concerned that an over-aggressive approach to mergers and acquisition, or some kind of artificial wall that says certain people can no longer bid on the next generation of startups, will also have a detriment to the ecosystem of investment that leads to innovation. What I think the questioner was asking about is predatory pricing, which is this idea in the United States that if you price below cost, antitrust will only step in if one can demonstrate that there is not the likelihood that you will recoup it at a later date. Meaning, if you live in a market, I can only sell something below the cost to produce it for so long before I go out of business. And the idea is, if I have deep pockets, I could sell something below cost for a really long time, drive everybody else out of the market. And then once everybody leaves the market, I can jack the price up and screw the consumer. That's a nice theory, but in practice, it doesn't happen. Why does it not happen? Because as soon as everybody leaves the market and I try to jack the prices up, people come back into the market and start selling again. So the United States has been very reluctant, and there has to be some very specific fact patterns that support a predatory pricing case. Just simply saying that because the company has lots of resources, they're going to afford themselves the luxury to lose money for an extended period of time to drive everybody out of the market is kind of a fallacy, because they have a responsibility to their shareholders to return a profit. So,
Amazon's a great example of the fact they didn't do that for many, many years while they, so I understand what you're saying, Sean, but I think that's why they chose Amazon, right? Though, because that's kind of the poster child. They kind of gutted Main Street businesses. Many of them left. And
people argued about that with Walmart a decade ago. These conversations are not exactly new.
Yeah. But I think it's very important, because I think in many times we're kind of talking broadly when really, as you have rightly pointed out in this, the issue is smaller. And so when you get to the root of what you're actually talking about, then you can see if there's existing legislation that applies, cases that apply, as opposed to conflating a lot of issues and fears into not so broad. I mean, this was John's whole point, and why, again, I encourage you to read his report. We're not being really specific when we're talking about defining the problem, forming a coherent strategy, and then implementation, and making sure that there aren't unintended consequences. That whole chain of events has to happen. Clete, I know you have some ideas about a path forward, because we're getting a little bit close to the end. I would like to hear what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, let me make a couple of points here, and I'll start with this one, which is I'm going to take the issue of the censorship of conservative voices, which is something that a lot of my friends on the right care about. And, again, I look at this bill as being punitive, not responsive to that issue. And I think there's a pretty easy path forward, pretty straightforward. I mean, number one, let's get a lot more transparency around this decision-making. Why was Donald Trump kicked off of these platforms? What was the decision-making that went into that? What were the standards that were applied? And let's get transparency about those decisions. Secondly, let's have reporting requirements. Let's figure out whether over time, all of these companies are applying that standard consistently. So what is your standard? How are you applying it in practice? Tell the US Congress. Third, once you've done that, and you can make an assessment as to whether it's been done in an even-handed way. If it has, great. If it hasn't, then there should be penalties associated with that. And that is directly responsive to the problem that a lot of people are concerned about on the right. And I don't think these bills scratch that surface. Two other quick points I want to make, because I think they're important. Just with respect to the bills themselves, we haven't yet talked enough, I don't think, about the ways in which they specifically advantage China. And I won't belabor this, but I do think it's important to put it on the table. I mean, there are one-way data sharing requirements here that would apply to our companies and require them to give over their data to Chinese competitors. That's crazy. And secondly, I want to take on this issue of self-preferencing, which sort of gets a bad name, even though it's a common business practice. It's sort of the integration of these platforms. I don't want to go to Google, search how to get somewhere, and then be redirected to Baidu Maps. And all that data location is going to be turned over to China. I don't want to go to Amazon and be redirected to Alibaba. So, I mean, I think that element to it is something we haven't yet explored. And then finally, last point, let's talk about an offensive agenda. Let's talk about what we actually want to do on the positive side. Instead of doing these things, what do we really want to be doing to help the US compete with China and with the rest of the world? I mean, for me, it starts going back to basics on tax and regulatory policy. I think we became a world leader because we had low taxes and low regulations. And I think we need to go back to that. Secondly, on trade, I would say there are two things. I give the administration credit for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but make it a real trade agreement. Really set standards in the digital area. Really open up markets for US companies. I think we should look at reforming the TPP instead of going back to IPEF. I understand that's a controversial position, but I would take a look at that. And then, pursue in the trade area, also pursue problems like we have with the EU. And then finally, I do think the China bill that we've talked about that's pending before Congress would be a good start. And we do need to figure out a way to get that done. Simply putting a $52 billion down payment on semiconductors isn't enough. But it is a start, and we should be doing more of that.
I want to jump in and get to Katie, some last thoughts from Katie before we go. And Katie, we're talking about trade. We're talking about trying to find, a smart way forward. A lot of questions about, how can you separate out national security and economic policy? We have somebody asking about high-tech cooperation and defense. I know you work in this area and have worked on public-private partnerships and with an eye on this international trade. Your thoughts as we close out about a constructive way forward. What should we be prioritizing?
Yeah, we should absolutely be prioritizing open and fair digital markets and use our trade policy to that end. Now, we've been doing exactly that with agreements like what's currently the CPTPP, which was TPPP, that we authored, where we authored the pioneering e-commerce chapter, that it has binding gold standard rules for digital trade. We have then taken that template and used that in USMCA with Mexico and Canada, and improved on it, in my view, as well. And these are, again, binding rules that countries have to adhere to promote transfer of data, data privacy as well, consumer protection, and ban things like customs duties on electronic transmissions or digital goods and so forth. In my view, these are very good templates that we have ourselves architected, but we need to start to apply these more broadly, whether it is through the existing trade agreements. We have a great network of trade deals, for instance, with Latin American countries. And I think there is willingness by many of them to add on these kinds of provisions that are in USMCA to these existing agreements. Or why not even think about bigger? As Cleve was saying, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity should be a real binding trade agreement with these partners in this critical region. Perhaps we could step into CPTPP, go back there to an agreement that is growing, that's becoming much more global. UK has sought accession. China has also sought accession. Of course, it doesn't meet the criteria, but I think we should engage there. Countries are ready; they are moving forward. And then in the Americas, why not have a digital trade agreement of the Americas? We've sought to integrate the hemisphere. We've done this in a kind of piecemeal fashion through trade agreements, and now there's an opportunity to leverage the templates we have to do this. I think there's a couple of things that we see over and over around the world that are happening and that really make this agenda very timely. One is that countries are around the world putting in place local digital regulations that are resulting in a very kind of somewhat restrictive trading arena, but also very divergent regulations, kind of a checkerboard of regulations, which of course hampers particularly our small businesses that are seeking to enter in different markets and diversify themselves when they have to comply with different digital regulations across markets, even if they were not that restrictive. And so I think if we could have these common rules of the game, use our existing templates and build on them, kind of future-proof ourselves so that we can have open trade lanes for our digital services and our digital products, that would be a very good thing going forward as well.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. This has been a very illuminating and informative conversation. I think we all understand that we're just scratched the surface. These are incredibly complex issues that are not going to go away. So I'd like to thank all of our guests for helping us think through some of the issues, the nuances, the trade-offs of tech policies as they relate to global economic competitiveness. Thank you all so much. Now, if you've not had the opportunity, please check out FP Analytics issue brief on this important topic, which is available on our events website. A big thanks again to the Computer and Communications Industry Association for supporting this project. Please join us next Tuesday, June 28th, for FP's inaugural Global Health Forum, which will be in person in Washington, D.C. and online. And stay tuned for future events at foreignpolicy.com. Thank you so much.